Death had already marked the white stallion, its stench rising from the grotesque wound that carved deep into his shoulder. But somehow his heart refused to surrender. The livestock auction barn reeked of desperation and abandonment, a place where broken dreams and unwanted lives came to find their final destination. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everything look more desperate than it already was. The concrete floors were stained with years of hoofprints, manure, and the quiet resignation of animals who had learned not to hope. In the furthest corner of the holding pens, deliberately separated from the sleek thoroughbreds and prize-winning quarter horses, stood a creature that had once been magnificent. The white stallion's coat, once pristine as fresh snow, was now dulled by neglect and matted with dirt. But it was the wound that made even the hardiest ranchers turn away in disgust. Above his left shoulder, a gaping infection festered and oozed, the flesh around it angry and swollen. The smell of rotting tissue mixed with the general stench of the auction yard, creating an atmosphere so thick with decay that men covered their noses when they passed. The stallion stood with his head lowered, each breath labored and painful, his ribs pressed against his hide, testament to weeks or perhaps months of inadequate care. Flies buzzed around the infected wound, landing and feeding, while he lacked the strength to shake them away. Other horses in nearby pens instinctively moved as far from him as possible, sensing the approach of death that seemed to cling to his weakened frame. Potential buyers walked past his pen without slowing their pace, their expressions ranging from revulsion to pity. Some shook their heads sadly. Others muttered about the cruelty of letting an animal suffer so long. A few commented that it would be a mercy to put him down immediately, that bringing him to auction was nothing more than prolonging his agony. The auctioneer, a weathered man named Bill Hutchins, whose calloused hands had handled thousands of horses over 3 decades, approached the stallion's pen with obvious reluctance. His weathered face showed the resignation of someone who had seen too many animals reach this desperate point. He knew what this horse represented: not a sale, not an opportunity, but a burden that someone would eventually have to shoulder. The stallion would likely end up at the slaughterhouse. His suffering finally ended in the most practical way possible. As Bill attached the lead rope to the stallion's halter, the horse lifted his head slightly, revealing eyes that still held a flicker of awareness despite the pain ravaging his body. For just a moment, something passed between man and animal, a recognition of mutual understanding about what came next. The stallion's fate seemed sealed before he even entered the auction ring. The moment the white stallion entered the auction ring, every person in that crowded barn understood they were witnessing something that should have been prevented long ago. The collective intake of breath was audible, followed immediately by a wave of uncomfortable murmurs that rippled through the seated crowd like disturbed water. Men who had seen decades of livestock auctions shifted uneasily in their metal folding chairs, their weathered faces betraying a mixture of disgust and pity that they rarely allowed themselves to show. The stallion's hooves echoed against the concrete floor of the ring, each step deliberate, despite the obvious pain coursing through his weakened body. His infected shoulder wept openly, the wound glistening under the harsh arena lights, while flies continued their relentless assault. Yet somehow, impossibly, he carried himself with a dignity that seemed to transcend his physical suffering. His head remained elevated, his ears forward, as if some deep memory of nobility refused to be extinguished by his current circumstances. Auctioneer Bill Hutchins cleared his throat into the microphone, the sound amplifying through speakers that had announced thousands of sales over the years. His usual enthusiastic pitch was notably absent, replaced by the flat tone of a man fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. The crowd sensed his reluctance, understanding that this was less about commerce and more about disposing of a problem that nobody wanted to claim. The bidding started at $25. An amount so insultingly low that it might as well have been an admission that the horse held no value beyond his weight in meat. The number hung in the air like an accusation, met by a silence so complete that the stallion's labored breathing became the dominant sound in the arena. People looked at their boots, at their hands, anywhere but at the suffering animal standing before them. Minutes passed without a single raised hand or spoken bid. The auctioneer's voice grew more desperate as he lowered the starting price again and again, each reduction a further erosion of the stallion's perceived worth. $15, $10. The numbers fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of discomfort but no action. The stallion stood motionless throughout the ordeal, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with what appeared to be understanding rather than hope. He seemed to comprehend that this ritual was merely a formality, that his fate had been decided long before he entered this ring. His breathing grew more labored, the infection clearly spreading its poison through his system with each passing moment. The silence stretched beyond uncomfortable into something approaching cruel, broken only by the occasional cough from the audience and the persistent buzz of flies. The stallion's legs trembled slightly, his strength ebbing as the infection consumed what little energy remained in his ravaged body. Time seemed suspended in that moment, as if the entire barn was holding its breath, waiting for someone to end the charade and accept what everyone believed was inevitable. Something extraordinary happened in that moment of crushing silence, when hope seemed as distant as starlight and every soul in that barn had written off the white stallion as beyond salvation. From the very back of the crowded auction hall, where shadows pooled between harsh fluorescent lights, a weathered hand rose with the deliberate certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions that others couldn't understand. The gesture cut through the oppressive quiet like a blade through fabric, so unexpected that several people turned in their seats to locate the source of this impossible interruption. Thomas Kane sat in the last row, his 73-year-old frame folded into a metal chair that had seen thousands of auctions come and go. His appearance was unremarkable, another weathered rancher in well-worn jeans and a faded plaid shirt, his gray beard neatly trimmed and his boots scuffed from decades of honest work. But his eyes held something different, a depth of understanding that came from 45 years of veterinary practice, from seeing countless animals at their most vulnerable moments and learning to recognize the difference between dying and merely suffering. While everyone else saw a hopeless case destined for the slaughterhouse, Thomas saw something that made his pulse quicken with recognition. The stallion's eyes weren't vacant or glazed with approaching death. They held awareness, intelligence, and most remarkably, a flicker of defiance that infection and neglect hadn't managed to extinguish. The horse was in pain, certainly, and the wound was severe, but Thomas had seen worse cases recover with proper care and unwavering patience. The auctioneer's voice cracked slightly as he processed what had just occurred, his microphone amplifying his disbelief across the stunned crowd. Heads turned like wheat in wind, craning to see who had dared to bid on what everyone considered a mercy case. Whispers began immediately, rippling through the audience in waves of confusion and judgment. Some shook their heads in pity for the old man's apparent foolishness. Others muttered about wasted money and false hope. But Thomas remained unmoved by their skepticism, his hand steady in the air until the bid was officially acknowledged. He had made his decision the moment he saw past the infection and recognized the horse's fundamental will to survive. The stallion seemed to sense the shift in energy, his ears twitching forward, as if something in the atmosphere had changed, as if the inevitability of his fate had suddenly cracked open to reveal an unexpected possibility. The crowd's shock was almost tangible, a collective intake of breath, followed by uncomfortable shifting and hushed conversations. Many of these men had known animals all their lives, but they couldn't fathom why someone would voluntarily take on what appeared to be nothing but heartbreak and veterinary bills. They saw only that infection, the suffering, the approaching end. Thomas saw potential for healing, for second chances, for the kind of transformation that happened when patients met compassion at exactly the right moment, when someone finally refused to look away. The $25 bid that echoed through the auction hall carried with it the weight of a decision that would forever divide Thomas Kane from every other person in that building, marking him as either a fool beyond measure or someone who understood something the rest of them had forgotten. The aftermath was immediate and uncomfortable, a ripple of disbelief that spread through the crowd like wildfire through dry grass. Men who had remained silent during the bidding suddenly found their voices, approaching Thomas with expressions ranging from genuine concern to barely concealed mockery. Their weathered faces clustered around him as he made his way toward the payment window, each offering unsolicited advice about the futility of his purchase. Some spoke with the patronizing tone reserved for the elderly making poor decisions, others with genuine bewilderment at what they perceived as throwing good money after bad. A few ranchers he recognized from years of similar auctions shook their heads with the resigned disappointment of watching a respected peer make what they considered a catastrophic error in judgment. But Thomas moved through their concerns with the quiet determination of someone who had long ago learned to trust his own instincts over popular opinion. His eyes remained fixed on the white stallion, who stood in the holding area with something that hadn't been there before. The horse's posture had shifted almost imperceptibly, his ears no longer pinned back in resignation, but forward with tentative awareness. Something fundamental had indeed changed in that moment of unexpected salvation, a recognition passing between man and animal that transcended the obvious obstacles ahead. The transaction was completed with unusual care, Thomas taking extra time to ensure the paperwork was properly filed and the horse's limited medical history documented. Loading the stallion into his modest 2-horse trailer required extraordinary patience, each step negotiated with gentle persistence rather than force. The horse's infected shoulder made mounting the ramp agonizing, his breathing labored and uneven, but he seemed to understand that this journey was different from whatever had brought him to this desperate place. The drive to Thomas's small ranch unfolded in contemplative silence, broken only by the occasional soft whimper that drifted forward from the trailer. Unlike the harsh mechanical sounds of livestock transport trucks, this journey carried an atmosphere of careful attention, of someone acutely aware of the fragile cargo he carried. Thomas found himself speaking softly to the horse through the gaps in the trailer, words of reassurance that may have been meant as much for himself as for his passenger. The weight of what he had undertaken settled around him like morning mist, not oppressive, but profound. He understood the magnitude of the infection, the slim odds of successful treatment, the likelihood that his $25 had purchased nothing more than the opportunity to provide a more comfortable death. Yet something in the stallion's eyes had spoken to decades of veterinary experience, whispering that beneath the suffering lay a will to survive that deserved at least one chance to prove itself. The road ahead stretched toward his ranch, carrying them both toward an uncertain future that would test everything Thomas believed about healing, hope, and the mysterious alchemy that sometimes transforms the dying into the living. What Thomas discovered in the gentle wash of his barn lights that first night would haunt him for weeks, a revelation so shocking that even his decades of veterinary experience couldn't fully prepare him for the horror of what neglect could do to a living creature. The infection that had seemed severe under the harsh fluorescence of the auction house revealed itself as something far more sinister in the steady illumination of his treatment area. The wound wasn't just infected, it was actively consuming the stallion from within, dead tissue spreading like dark fingers beneath skin that should have been white as mountain snow. The smell hit him first, a putrid sweetness that spoke of flesh surrendering to decay while the heart still fought to beat. Thomas had to step back momentarily, his experienced stomach rebelling against the concentrated essence of suffering that filled the enclosed space. The stallion stood with trembling legs, his entire body radiating the fever that was cooking him from the inside out. His temperature registered dangerously high, his breathing shallow and rapid, each exhale carrying the heat of internal fire. Thomas named him Gabriel. In that moment, perhaps seeking divine intervention, or simply needing to give dignity to what might become a final vigil, the angel's name seemed fitting for a creature hovering so precariously between earthly suffering and whatever peace might lie beyond. Gabriel's eyes, though clouded with pain, tracked Thomas's movements with an awareness that suggested his spirit remained intact even as his body waged war against itself. The night stretched into an endless sequence of treatments, each procedure a negotiation between hope and medical reality. Thomas cleaned the wound with surgical precision, debriding dead tissue while Gabriel stood with surprising patience, as if understanding that this pain was different from the neglect that had brought him here. Antibiotics flowed into his system through carefully placed IV lines, while pain medication tried to provide some relief from the agony that had become his constant companion. Several times during those dark hours, Thomas paused in his work, looking into Gabriel's fever-bright eyes and questioning whether his intervention was mercy or prolonged cruelty. The stallion's breathing would become so labored that Thomas prepared himself for the inevitable, only to watch as some deeper reserve of strength pulled Gabriel back from the precipice. Each crisis passed like a storm, leaving both man and horse exhausted, but somehow still connected to the possibility of dawn. The barn filled with the quiet sounds of careful nursing, the soft hiss of saline solutions, the gentle rustle of fresh bandages, the whispered encouragement that Thomas offered without conscious thought. Gabriel responded to his voice, ears twitching forward when he spoke, finding some comfort in human presence that promised safety rather than abandonment. As the first pale light of morning crept through the barn windows, Gabriel still stood, still breathed, still held that flicker of defiance in his dark eyes. The infection hadn't surrendered, the fever still raged, but neither had claimed victory. Thomas realized he had witnessed something profound during that endless night, not just the tenacity of life refusing to yield, but the mysterious alchemy that occurs when patience meets compassion in the darkest hour, when someone refuses to stop believing in the possibility of healing, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. The miracle of healing revealed itself not in dramatic moments of sudden recovery, but in whispers so quiet that only someone watching with the devotion of a monk could detect the sacred shift from dying toward living. Thomas discovered that hope measured itself in teaspoons rather than buckets, in the barely perceptible lightening of Gabriel's breathing during the third week, in the way his ears no longer lay flat against his skull in constant anticipation of pain. These fragments of progress accumulated like morning dew, invisible in isolation but undeniable in their collective weight. Each dawn brought Thomas to Gabriel's stall, with the careful attention of someone reading scripture, searching for signs that might reveal whether his faith in the stallion's recovery was justified, or merely the delusion of an old man who had forgotten how to accept defeat. The fever chart became his prayer book, temperatures recorded with meticulous precision that traced the gradual retreat of infection's burning assault. When Gabriel's temperature dropped 2 degrees after 10 days of relentless heat, Thomas felt something crack open in his chest, a cautious joy that he hardly dared acknowledge. The wound itself told its own story of cellular warfare and slow victory, the angry red edges gradually cooling to pink, then pale. The constant weeping reduced to occasional moisture. Thomas documented each millimeter of healing tissue with photographs that captured what words couldn't express, evidence that Gabriel's body was remembering how to repair itself. The smell of decay gave way to the clean scent of fresh bandages and antiseptic hope. But the most profound transformation occurred in the space between approach and retreat, in the gradual dissolution of Gabriel's flinching response to human presence. Thomas measured this progress in footsteps, noting how Gabriel no longer pressed himself against the far wall when the stall door opened, how his trembling subsided more quickly after treatments, how his eyes began tracking Thomas's movements with curiosity rather than terror. The stallion's recognition of safety happened in increments so small they felt like secrets shared between species. The first time Gabriel lowered his head to accept Thomas's touch without medication to dull his senses, the moment lasted only seconds, but carried the weight of complete transformation. His muzzle, soft as velvet despite everything he had endured, pressed gently against Thomas's palm with tentative trust that spoke louder than any victory song. This wasn't just physical healing but the restoration of faith itself, the rebuilding of belief that humans could bring comfort rather than harm. Gabriel's appetite returned like a timid animal, emerging from deep forest, first refusing everything, then accepting small handfuls of sweet hay, finally showing genuine enthusiasm for the carefully prepared meals that Thomas offered 3 times daily. Each bite represented a choice to continue living, a daily referendum on whether existence held enough promise to justify the effort of healing. By the end of the 4th week, Gabriel stood differently, weight distributed evenly rather than favoring his injured shoulder, head carried with something approaching the dignity that Thomas had glimpsed beneath layers of suffering. The infection had retreated, but left its signature in scar tissue that would forever mark this chapter of survival. Thomas understood that these scars weren't disfigurement, but testimony, evidence of a battle fought and won through patience, medicine, and the mysterious alchemy that occurs when someone refuses to abandon hope even when hope seems foolish. The healing of flesh proved to be merely the prelude to a far more delicate restoration, one that required not antibiotics and bandages, but something infinitely more precious and harder to administer: the patient rebuilding of a soul that had learned to expect only cruelty from human hands. Thomas understood that Gabriel's physical recovery, remarkable as it had been, was simply the foundation for the deeper work that lay ahead, the careful reconstruction of trust that had been shattered by whatever circumstances had led to that infected wound, and the desperate auction where they had found each other. The hours Thomas spent in Gabriel's stall evolved from medical necessity into something approaching meditation, both man and horse learning to exist in shared silence that spoke more eloquently than any training manual ever could. Thomas would position his weathered camp chair just outside the stall door, close enough for presence but far enough to avoid pressure, allowing Gabriel to dictate the terms of their slowly developing relationship. These sessions stretched through morning coffee and afternoon shadows, time measured not by clocks, but by the gradual relaxation of muscles held too long in defensive tension. Gabriel's personality emerged like spring revealing itself after harsh winter, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as each day proved that gentleness was not a trap, but a genuine offering. The stallion's intelligence became apparent in small displays of curiosity, the way he investigated new objects with careful deliberation, how he learned to associate Thomas's footsteps with comfort rather than pain. Playfulness returned in unexpected moments. A gentle nudge against Thomas's shoulder, the mischievous theft of his hat, behaviors that suggested the horse was remembering joy as a possibility rather than a distant memory. The transformation amazed Thomas daily, watching Gabriel evolve from a creature who had simply endured existence into one who actively participated in living. The horse's eyes, once clouded with resignation, began to hold the bright awareness that Thomas had glimpsed during that first auction, the spark that had convinced him to raise his hand when everyone else had already written Gabriel off as hopeless. Affection developed gradually, Gabriel learning to seek out Thomas's presence, to lean into gentle touches, to find comfort in the steady rhythm of shared breathing during their quiet sessions. Thomas discovered something unexpected happening within himself during these months of patient restoration. The emptiness that had settled into his retirement like dust in unused rooms began to lift, replaced by purpose that felt both familiar and entirely new. His veterinary career had been fulfilling, decades spent healing animals and easing suffering, but this relationship with Gabriel transcended professional duty. This was personal, profound, a daily choice to believe in the possibility of complete healing when others had seen only approaching death. The connection between them deepened beyond the typical bond between human and animal, becoming something that felt almost mystical in its intensity. Thomas recognized that in saving Gabriel, he had somehow saved something essential within himself, filling the void left by career's end with work that mattered in ways that couldn't be quantified or explained. They had rescued each other, though only one of them had been dying in an auction ring, when their paths converged. The whispers began in coffee shops and feed stores, carried by voices that had witnessed something they couldn't quite explain, spreading through the tight-knit farming community like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Word of Gabriel's transformation traveled along dusty backroads and over barbed wire fences, reaching people who remembered the auction night when most had looked away from a dying horse, but one man had refused to surrender to what seemed inevitable. The story grew with each telling, not through exaggeration but through the simple power of truth that defied common sense and challenged assumptions about what was possible when compassion met determination. The first visitors arrived hesitantly, their pickup trucks crunching down Thomas's gravel drive with the uncertain energy of people drawn by curiosity, but unsure of their welcome. These were the same ranchers and farmers who had shaken their heads in the auction house, convinced that Thomas's $25 bid represented either foolish sentiment or the beginning stages of senility. They came expecting to find confirmation of their practical wisdom, perhaps a freshly dug grave, or evidence that good intentions couldn't overcome hard realities. Instead, they found Gabriel standing in morning sunlight, his white coat gleaming with health, moving across the pasture with fluid grace that spoke of complete healing rather than merely survived trauma. The infected wound had become a faint line of scar tissue, barely visible unless someone knew to look for it, a subtle reminder of how close death had come before retreating in defeat. The stallion's eyes held bright intelligence and calm confidence, qualities that seemed impossible to reconcile with their memories of the broken animal who had stood in that auction ring awaiting disposal. Some visitors found themselves unexpectedly moved to tears, overwhelmed by the visual proof that their assumptions about hopeless cases might need serious reconsideration. Men who prided themselves on practical judgment and realistic expectations discovered emotions they hadn't anticipated, forced to confront the uncomfortable possibility that they might have been wrong about more than just one horse's potential for recovery. The transformation challenged their worldview in ways that went far beyond animal husbandry, raising questions about what other opportunities for redemption they might have dismissed as impractical idealism. Gabriel seemed to understand his role as living testament to the power of second chances, approaching visitors with gentle curiosity rather than the fear that might have been expected from an animal who had experienced such profound suffering. His calm presence and obvious contentment served as wordless argument for the value of refusing to abandon hope, even when hope seemed unreasonable. Thomas watched these encounters with quiet satisfaction, understanding that Gabriel had become something larger than one horse's remarkable recovery. The stallion represented proof that healing was possible, even in seemingly hopeless circumstances, that patience and compassion could achieve what practical wisdom deemed impossible. Each visitor left changed in some small way, carrying with them evidence that miracles happened, not through divine intervention, but through human refusal to accept defeat when something precious hung in the balance. The ranch had become an unexpected pilgrimage site, drawing people who needed to witness transformation they could barely believe possible, leaving them with expanded understanding of what qualified as realistic hope. The transformation that began with $25 and a dying horse had rippled outward in ways that neither Thomas nor Gabriel could have anticipated, creating circles of influence that touched lives far beyond the boundaries of one small ranch, where healing had defied every reasonable expectation. Gabriel now moved through his days with the effortless grace of an animal who had rediscovered what it meant to live without fear, his white coat catching morning light like fresh snow, unmarked by anything except the faint scar tissue that served as quiet testimony to a battle fought and won against overwhelming odds. Thomas found himself changed in ways that went deeper than purpose or renewed energy, fundamentally altered by the daily witness of resurrection accomplished through patience rather than miracles. The bond between them had evolved beyond the typical relationship between human and animal into something that felt almost sacred, a connection forged in the crucible of shared suffering and mutual salvation. Gabriel had taught him that healing wasn't always about fixing what was broken, but sometimes about learning to see brokenness as the beginning of something entirely new, rather than the end of something lost. The scars on Gabriel's shoulder had become conversation pieces rather than sources of shame, evidence of survival rather than failure, proof that the most profound beauty often emerged from the deepest wounds when someone cared enough to nurture recovery with unwavering faith. Visitors continued to arrive at the ranch, drawn by stories they had heard but needed to witness personally, leaving with expanded understanding of what was possible when compassion refused to accept defeat as inevitable. Gabriel had become more than a rescued horse. He had evolved into a living lesson about the transformative power of refusing to abandon hope, even when hope seemed unreasonable. His presence challenged assumptions about what qualified as salvageable, forcing people to reconsider their own definitions of worth, potential, and the mysterious alchemy that sometimes occurred when patients met suffering at exactly the right moment. Children who met him learned that gentleness could triumph over cruelty, while adults discovered that their practical wisdom might benefit from occasional doses of impractical faith. The ranch itself had been transformed by Gabriel's presence, becoming a place where people came to witness proof that healing was possible, even in circumstances that appeared hopeless. Thomas understood that their story had become larger than either of them individually, representing something essential about the human capacity to see potential where others saw only problems, to invest time and resources in outcomes that couldn't be guaranteed but were worth pursuing anyway. As Gabriel grazed peacefully in afternoon sunlight, his tail swishing contentedly while he explored grass that tasted of freedom rather than desperation, Thomas reflected on how one moment of decision at a livestock auction had fundamentally altered both their destinies. They had found each other at exactly the right moment, when one needed saving and the other needed purpose, proving that sometimes the most broken things could indeed become the most beautiful when given the chance to heal under the careful attention of someone who refused to look away. If this story of Gabriel's miraculous transformation touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of hope, healing, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.